for the council meeting for North Huron. Confirmation of the agenda that the Council Township of North Huron hereby accept the agenda for July 5th, 2019 special council meeting as presented. Do I have a mover? I have Trevor, seconder. Anita, all in favor? Carries. Declaration of pecuniary interest. Seeing none, we're going to move right on to number 4, the public meetings and hearings and delegation. Andrew Garland from BM Ross and Associates. Is the servicing capacity of the Wingham Standpipe. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor and members of council, for having me. My name is Andrew Garland with BM Ross and Associates in Goderich, and for some time now, we've been working with your staff looking at water and wastewater servicing needs for both Wingham and Blyth as part of a broader master plan for those communities. There it did go. Just a bit of a brief agenda for what I'm here to talk about this morning. Really quickly, just 30 seconds or so, I'll talk to you a little bit about what we've been working on just in general as part of the master plan, but then get more specifically into water and wastewater servicing in each community, looking at commitments and then comparing that to what each of your systems is currently using and what that leaves available for other development and other commitments. If at any point in time during the presentation something's not clear, you have any questions, I won't be offended if you interrupt me and ask a question about something. In fact, I prefer that to make sure that you know what I'm talking about. So feel free to do that. Going back, it's probably close to a year and a half now, or a little more than that, is when we started working with your staff, looking at what a master plan would look like for your township. You had a pretty significant amount of grant money through the Clean Water and Wastewater Fund allocated towards this. So that's good news, I think, for you that a lot of this is funded through that. And it's, I think I could say, probably one of the more comprehensive master plans that we've been involved with in terms of what you're looking to tackle and accomplish. But I think ultimately that's good news for you. It's going to leave you with more information and more well-informed opinions on what kind of needs you have in the community compared to some of these assignments we work on. So as part of the master plan process, we're working with your staff to look at potential scale and rate of development in your communities, looking at what major triggers would cause you to look at expansion of facilities like water treatment, water storage, wastewater treatment, wastewater pumping facilities, and triggers more related to development status rather than just calendar year or time. As part of this also, we're analyzing your water distribution system, all the water mains, your wastewater collection system, and then just using that to compare to what the projected needs will be down the road and current needs as well. A big part of this project that is not commonly done with master plans, I would say, was actually getting physical inspections of your systems. So for sewers, doing flushing and camera work, which is just way better in terms of assessing what the pipe condition actually is. A lot of cases, people are making decisions and opinions based on simply the age of the pipe, which is a metric that's useful to an extent, but sometimes other factors affect pipe condition that age alone can't tell you. We had some electrical and mechanical experts in to assess some of that type of works in your treatment and pumping facilities, just to get, again, more informed based on real information, real data, opinions of what your facility needs are. And then through all of that, really putting that to work, all that background information and data into asset management planning, which is something that over the next couple of years, the government is starting to mandate. Municipalities look harder and harder and better at developing asset management plans that go beyond just based on looking at asset ages. So I think we're going to put you in a good position by the time this project's done on that. And then with all that information, also reviewing your water and wastewater rates and your financial plans to make sure everything really jives together. So again, a pretty broad, pretty comprehensive exercise, but I think it will be a useful product for you when it's done. So today, talking specifically about water and wastewater servicing needs. What we do is we'll look at what a facility is designed and rated and approved for, and then just start to kind of go through what allocations are there for existing customers. So with 2019, July 2019, what's your current usage like? Then start to look at, in terms of development, what plans are already approved, what's there in draft, what might be coming down the line, and then look at those really in terms of commitments. So for Wingham, from the start of this process, we were kind of viewing, okay, between A2A and Hutton, early on we were saying between Hutton Heights and A2A, two fairly big development parcels. At the start of the process, maybe weren't predicting that both of them would go, so we kind of started out looking at A2A alone and said, if that whole site developed 450 plus units, what would that look like in terms of a commitment? And then in recent months, we know that talks about Hutton Heights have been kind of heating up again. So now we're going to look at what if we treated both of those parcels as development commitments, and we had to make sure you had the available capacity to fully service both of those. In Blyth, we know there's development going on there, so a little over 100 units, treating that as a...
Can I just ask, because I'm not familiar with the GJAJ Holdings, is that's not the development at the, sorry?
That's the run subdivision.
And is that many? I thought it was only 16 or something.
I don't know if it's phased, but the information that we had early on would be that at full scale,
Okay.
that's what it might look like.
Thank you.
And the property behind too.
And then for each community above and beyond kind of those known developments, we just made a gross assumption of an additional 25 kind of infill lots to be piecemealed in there. So in addition to those development commitments, we know that specific to Wingham, you have the cross-border servicing agreement as well. And regardless of what the current usage is, we want to look at that as if each customer were fully using their allotted capacity per the agreement, treat that as a commitment that way, because we want to view that they're entitled to use what the agreement says. So all those developments and that agreement, we treat as commitments, and then add that to what your existing customer usage is, and then look what's left over really beyond that in terms of capacity. When we're looking at those developments that don't exist already, and trying to predict what will they take up in terms of capacity once they are developed, we try to develop what we call an equivalent residential unit for your average typical home in each community. How much water do they take up on a day? What kind of wastewater flow are they sending per day? And for Wingham, we see that in terms of a maximum day usage. So when I say maximum day for water, what I mean is if you look at from January 1 to December 31 in any given year, you take a single 24-hour period, what's the single highest 24-hour period usage during that time? And for water, it's a little over 1.2 cubic meters per day in Wingham, and wastewater just a bit above that. That's not very typical, close to a 1-to-1 ratio there, I would say, for a lot of communities. And we think that part of what's contributing to that in Wingham is that going back in time, the sewer system was really a combined system, sanitary sewage and storm flows in there as well, and that's driving up the wastewater flow. I guess when I say it's not that common, for years in a lot of communities it would be common, and it's the kind of thing that you just sort of chip away at over time as streets are reconstructed and projects are done, separating the storm and the sanitary, and we don't think that's a bad approach to just kind of gradually work away at that. In Blyth, kind of on a per household basis, the water demand looks a little bit higher than Wingham. That's possibly due to a result of just smaller population and fewer number of houses to kind of distribute the average over. And then for wastewater, that sort of 2-to-1 ratio, water to wastewater, may be a little bit more common in some communities, with wastewater at about 0.84 cubic meters per day. We take those rates and then apply them to the number of development units potential in each community to come up with a projection on what your needs are.
Can I just intervene again just for a second? So you're taking these rate-off flows that are actually happening now. So when you
Yeah.
say Wingham and Blythe, you're also including outlying projects such as Morris Turnberry and Central here. That flow is involved in that. So when you say that.
Yeah, good
Thank you.
question. We're looking at if you have 1,000 homes right now in the community, we take what the total flow is for the community and then just divide that by 1,000 to determine. So for the Wingham systems, that cross-border servicing agreement, in terms of water, we're doing 682 cubic meters per day as a commitment, and wastewater 247.7. So those equivalent residential units don't come into play there. These numbers are just from the agreement. But then taking those equivalent residential unit values for Wingham and Blythe, if we apply it to the total number of units, we're looking at water and wastewater, a little over 700 cubic meters a day each in Wingham. And then for Blythe, a little over 200 cubic meters a day for water and a little over 100 for wastewater. So then taking that background information on what the demands are and what they could be, you start to compare that to what your systems are actually capable of producing for water or capable of treating for wastewater. So in Wingham, you've got the two well systems, well 3 and well 4. Well 3 with a rated capacity a little over 6,500 cubic meters a day, well 4 close to 5,300. Per Ministry of Environment guidelines, we always want to look at what they call the firm capacity of the system, and all that really means is you look at your system assuming that your largest single producing well is out of service. So, assuming it's down because there was an unexpected failure, you're doing planned maintenance or something like that. What's the system safely able to handle, assuming that largest well out of service? So for Wingham, the firm capacity then is the well 4 capacity at 5,270, quite a bit higher than your current maximum day of 2,200 cubic meters a day. And then just trying to visualize that on a graph, the sort of bluish color there in that chart representing the existing maximum day demand of 2,277. Taking all those commitments, cross-border servicing and the A2A lands and the Hutton Height lands would represent close to 1,400 cubic meters a day as committed capacity. So what we would call your uncommitted reserve that'd be available for more demand, more development even beyond what you're contemplating, is close to 1,600 cubic meters a day. And in terms of equivalent residential units, that's almost exactly 1,300 more. So in our opinion, we got lots and lots of capacity with water. The one thing this doesn't fully capture, I suppose, is that for water, in addition to that maximum 24-hour period, you've also got to look at peak times throughout the day, which could last for minutes or a couple of hours. People are filling pools or watering lawns or whatever's going on. That could drive up higher. And in the absence of adequate storage to help buffer those peaks, your treatment system has to be able to keep up with what the demand is. You do have a storage facility here that can help with that. It wouldn't fully cover what sort of guideline values would be. But as you know, we're working on that as well with your staff, looking at new water storage facility here in town as well. So, I mean, why am I saying all this? It's certainly not to scare you. We still think you're in pretty good shape on the water here, but it's just a reminder that in the absence of good, proper storage, you'd have to be a little bit more concerned of what those peak rates would be, and it wouldn't paint, it would still paint an adequate picture, an okay picture, it just wouldn't be as positive as what this is showing. So that's kind of, I guess, a nice segue into storage. Again, per Ministry of Environment guidelines, really there are 3 purposes for storage. Equalization is just a fancier way of saying that buffering of those peak demands. Also, there are ways to determine recommended volumes for fire protection, fire storage, and then what they consider emergency beyond that. For your existing population and existing demand, the total recommended storage per guidelines would be just under 1,700 cubic meters per day. And then if we're looking at all those development lands being fully utilized, it would get up closer to 2,700 cubic meters per day. So your existing standpipe is almost close to matching what the existing recommended volume is at 1,680 cubic meters a day. But the problem with it is, aside from some of the structural condition concern, is that really because of gravity working against you, it's only the top couple of meters of that standpipe that are readily available. And in a more modern facility, we'd incorporate some booster pumping equipment that would allow you to really draw down the full volume from that standpipe and make it usable out to the distribution system. So again, because of some of the concerns with the existing physical condition of that standpipe and because of a little bit of a shortfall on the available volume, that's why we're working with your staff to look at how to address that.
Andrew, how fast is their recovery? Like it has storage of this much.
Yeah.
And then water's coming in treated. How fast is that? So does it at all equal what's going out, or
If
close, or what?
if you had a great big demand due to something like a fire, both your wells would end up turning on and providing water to the system, and that would, I don't know what it would be in terms of minutes or hours, but it would allow that standpipe to draw down relatively slowly. But in the event one of those wells were out or failed, that 230 cubic meters of what we call like usable volume in that standpipe would be gone pretty quickly. For Blyth, your water system, I guess I should just clarify to make sure though. Any other questions about the Wingham water system?
So this, I'm a little bit confused though. So in that standpipe, there's 1,680 cubic meters of water,
That's right.
but we can only use 232 of it?
Yeah, practically. I mean, you can allow it to draw down below that even, but then you'd be below recommended pressures. So the ministry will also give guidelines on what allowable pressures would be in the system, and the concern being that if you draw down too low and the pressure drops too much, for one thing, people won't be able to get water out of their fixtures, but the bigger concern would eventually become to actually depressurize the system. So right now you picture your water main network being pressurized. If there were ever a leak or an opening in a pipe or even through someone's faucet, as long as that system's pressurized, it's making sure water's only going out. And as soon as you depressurize it, that would allow potentially for sources of contamination to come back in. And that's why they don't want you to drop below a certain number. So it's the usability of it, but also the safety side of it.
And because of the age of this standpipe, is that technology changed in the readily available today? Like, I'm assuming in a new technology driven standpipe, this would not be common.
That's right. In the absence, it would still be the case in the absence of a booster pumping facility. But if we're to do this today, and you had a standpipe that looked just like that, right beside the standpipe, there'd be a little square building with one or two pumps inside, and we could just do a piping and valve arrangement that as soon as that 232 cubic meters was used up, that's available by gravity, that would trigger one of the pumps to turn on. And even though it looks like that water's up above ground, it starts to suck it out of there and pump it out from the pump. So it's it's almost like an above ground version of an in-ground reservoir, water storage reservoir kind of thing.
So could I just do a follow-up to Trevor's question? So in today's modern technology, we're looking, like right now, I think we're looking at about an $8 million tank that's this high, and you're telling us that 90% of the water is simply there for it to pressure down and make everything work. In today's modern technology, could we be looking at a tank at half that price and booster pumps to fill in for it if we're never gonna use the water in there?
Right. There's, I mean, if we were starting from scratch, we would compare, say, an in-ground reservoir, and then there's a different from a standpipe, but also elevated storage would be what they call like an elevated tank. And it's really trying to put all the water up in the top 5 or 10 meters of height. It's just on a concrete pedestal. So you'll have seen these in different communities around, but it makes all the water available by gravity. Construction wise, there's almost no question they're more expensive. They take more land footprint, that's for sure. And so, and frankly, in different communities, different operators, some people just have preferences for one style over the other. We try to not be too partial, and we try to work with what operations and staff preferences are, but then also just look at the constraints of each community in terms of elevation, in terms of available land, and you kind of have to consider all those things. It's nice to put storage on the opposite end of your source of supply in communities, which is largely what you have right now. Because of the elevation, that standpipe is really at the ideal spot in town for elevated storage. So even in modern situations, you wouldn't rule out that kind of thing right off the bat. You just kind of have to compare what options are realistically achievable in your town, and then what would each one of them actually cost when it comes to.
Because just to fall back on that, because I believe in Blyth, we do not have a standpipe at all, just pumps. Which,
You have a small reservoir, in-ground reservoir.
oh, in-ground reservoir.
Yeah, but.
And then in Wingham, we've got this $8 million or whatever it is tank that we're looking at purchasing. So I guess I was just kind of, is there a happy medium in there between one and the other when you're looking at this? Or are we just looking at the tank is 75 feet high and we're gonna build another 75-foot high tank because it was always there?
Right. In almost any other community, we've worked on this kind of thing recently, and we've compared the economics of, say, it's usually come down to an in-ground concrete reservoir versus an elevated tank. And often over the terms of a life cycle, say 25 or 50 years that you're looking at, the cost difference between the two isn't wildly different, and it will come down to, again, what your operations staff are desiring, and again, the available land and elevations are a huge factor in what's suitable. So in Wingham, for example, looking at municipally owned lands, there's not a lot of it that would be big enough to fit storage, and then even some of it that is big enough to fit storage, it's at low elevation, in some cases even in floodplains where it wouldn't be ideal. You certainly wouldn't do elevated storage there because you'd have a tower that might be beyond what construction practices would allow, so then you'd be into, excuse me, you'd definitely be into like an in-ground reservoir then, and then the economics wouldn't be wildly different than looking at elevated.
Okay, thank you.
How much land is required, or would be required for us?
Some of the main players, I guess, in the province that we've talked to would say at a very minimum, the smallest sites they work on would be like 100 feet by 100 feet. And even then, there can be concern on, you go next door then at that property line, how close is the neighbor's house or whatever building, because there can be, when they're coating, there can be overspray. When they're welding up top, there can be debris falling down. They've been asked to work in some ugly places before where they'd end up then having to go touch up paint on people's vehicles or fix shingles on people's houses because of that. So in one community that we're working right now, they had a very confined space, for what would have been a $2.5 or $3 million tank. They said that the site was so small that by the time they put all the special kind of covering around and special building techniques, it would add $1 million to the cost to construct a $3 million tank. So that's just how much the spatial constraints can affect you on that. And then you got to look at down the road. It's not just building it. It's 20 years or 30 years down the road, and you have to recode it or touch something up. And then you're into the same thing all over again, trying to protect the surrounding properties. So move on to the Blyth water system. Again, similar to Wingham, you got two different well sites. At one of them, there are two wells, but really one of them works at a time. So again, looking at firm capacity, that would be assuming that well 5 is offline, and you see your firm capacity be almost 1150 cubic meters a day, and your current maximum day we consider to be about 810 cubic meters a day. There have been a couple days over the last years where it's been pushing like a little over 1,000, but something special was going on with operators flushing hydrants, and we try to discount those kind of things because they can be planned around. So once we do the math again at looking at what the current usage is, and then applying the equivalent residential units and treating that as commitments, see that existing demand again, 810 is about 70% of the firm capacity. Commitments of about 211 cubic meters a day leaves an uncommitted reserve then of 128 cubic meters a day, which at current usage is 79 equivalent residential units. The same comment that I made about Wingham and having to look at peak demands would apply here as well. You do have some storage. There's a reservoir at one of the well sites that's close to 380 cubic meters. So you do use that for some equalization right now. But again, comparing it to what the ministry guidelines would be when you do the equalization and the fire protection and emergency for your existing population, existing situation, the guideline value would be 821 cubic meters of storage. And then looking down the road at adding commitments, close to 1,000 cubic meters of storage. So one of the long-term recommendations from the master plan will be to look at storage and Blyth as well. But again, probably just given this kind of structural condition of the facility in Wingham, really I think drives a need to look at it as kind of a priority. I guess I should check on that. Before we get into wastewater, any other questions about water? It's okay if you think of them later too, that's fine. Your wastewater plant, wastewater plants in general, I should say, we're a little bit less concerned about that maximum day or the peak rates. You got to pay attention to them in terms of how the plant physically operates, but in terms of how the plant is viewed for compliance purposes with your approval document from the ministry, it's all based on monthly or annual average values. And that's really a consideration driven by contaminant loadings to the stream. One peak flow day isn't going to be a really big factor in terms of looking at environmental impact. It's kind of the longer term average we're looking at. So that's why they rate these plants on an annual average day basis. So the Wingham wastewater plant capacity, 3,400 cubic meters a day. Current average day is a little over 2,300 cubic meters. When we evaluate plant performance and capacity, we can't look at just the flow numbers. We also have to look at the wastewater strength and how the plant is performing. But the analysis that we've done today would suggest that looking at it in kind of gross terms based on flow is a pretty reasonable approach for evaluating what your reserve will be. So applying, looking at existing flows, 2,300 cubic meters a day. Commitments again is assuming full use of the cross-border servicing agreement, full development of A2A and full development of Hutton Heights. Your commitments would be close to 1,000 cubic meters a day, or 30% of the plant overall capacity, and that would still leave an uncommitted reserve of 115 cubic meters a day, or about 92 equivalent residential units. So not a huge amount of uncommitted reserve there. I guess we would just say, like, in our opinion, you have to consider how quickly would A2A and Hutton Heights and that come to full utilization. And then based on some assumption there would kind of drive how soon you need to look at doing something at the plant.
Andrew, just a comment though, on, like in Wingham, if you put all of those uncommitted, all those commitments on the table, there isn't any more land, like in Wingham. Like if A2A was fully used, Hutton Heights was fully used, and the whole Morris Turnberry agreement is used, what else is there? There isn't any. We don't have any more land associated to the town, to Wingham Ward. So the concern would be is, what is the uncommitted going to be used for other than infill lot? But you've already covered some of that as well. So I guess it's a concern question that I would have, is that after everything's committed, what would we have to do other than if we had to buy land? We would have to buy land in Morris Turnberry in order to do that, to grow the Wingham Ward and the Wingham Ward's plant capacity. Because that, to me, that's the only thing we have.
That can always happen. You can always,
Boundaries can change.
boundaries can change, and they.
Right, but I think from my perspective though is we're looking at those commitments today is a 20-year projection, right? Like in my mind, that's at least 20 years from a capacity perspective. So
Far away.
I don't think we have to take away that we have to keep an eye on it, but I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that 3% uncommitted shouldn't scare us, that we're getting to the point of full capacity.
So I'll just follow up with that, Trev. My vision of what's going to happen in the next decade is we have agreed to run the water and do the Hutton Heights. Between here and Hutton Heights, I know there's a lot of swampland, but there was on the edge of Wingham when I was a kid all through there. Matter of fact, there wasn't even roads, we'll remember when we were kids through there. We had to come up Diagonal Street. Remember that, guys? So we have the roads in our lifetime. We're now infilled, I call it Zares, the Value Mart and all that down there was swampland, nobody built there. We just ran the water out to East Walmanash to Hutton Heights. And my vision is that will fill. That will be the one that we'll be watching. Having said that, I'm with you, Trevor. I'm not worried about it because I don't really see 400 houses, and we can change that commitment as we move forward. But that's the vision I see, is we're going to expand into East Walmanash.
See any calculations for industrial use? I'm just saying with 400 new homes, you might have new industry, and their requirements could be quite large. I don't see any, the uncommitted for anything. This is all residential, not industrial.
Good question. When in any community where there's a known really significant industrial or commercial user, we try to factor those out. So even for Wingham, we took out like the 10 largest users, which in your case would include like the car wash and the hospital for water, that kind of thing. But really all other industrial commercial enterprises would be kind of grouped in with that equivalent residential unit. And the assumption is, it's not perfect, but the assumption is that as residential units increase, industrial, commercial, institutional uses would kind of grow proportionally to it. If you had a significant, say, industrial subdivision, there are ministry guideline values for what you should apply on like a per hectare usage. Our experience has been that those numbers are really not ideal to use. They tend to shoot high. We see a lot of drier industries, I would say, in the areas we work in.
One brewery would not that
Yeah,
well.
yeah, that's right. So yeah, it's a good question. If there was a parcel that something really specific or unusual was thought, that should be treated separately. And then ideally, if someone's coming looking to develop that, they've probably done some kind of their own calculations on what their needs would be. And then you can just say, okay, if we had 100 or 500 equivalent residential units worth of capacity left, how much of that are they taking out of what's available?
I'm just thinking that most of our expansion in industrial now is in a different municipality that we're supplying, and that it's only 3%. That could be taken up quite quickly by
Sure.
one industry.
You're saying that the commitments are taken into effect for outlying areas up there, right?
What the current cross-border servicing agreement
Mhm.
states, the commitments is considering that fully.
And they can't go exceed that at all, right?
With wastewater, one thing that the Ministry of Environment will ask you to do on an annual basis, and your operators they put out an annual report. And once your flows hit about the 80% capacity mark, the ministry will start to ask each year that annual report contain some kind of description or dialogue on what will the municipality plan to do to address it if flows continue to increase. And for a long time, it's been kind of an unwritten rule. Some people get really excited about it, like it's a hard and fast rule of 80%. It's more of a guideline, but it's recognizing that from the day that you see you're going to need a wastewater plant expansion or something, it's probably going to be at least a 3 and maybe a 5-year process before you get through all the assessment and approval and planning and then design and construction work done. So you're not going to go from 80% to 100% overnight unless something really weird and wonderful happens. In most cases, that 80% rule of thumb is going to allow you time to plan and deal with that. So it's something that you're right, like the 3% uncommitted reserve isn't a huge buffer, but by the time that existing flow number gets from 68% of your capacity up to 80%, I would imagine you're still going to have a reasonable amount of time following that to plan for what's next. For Blyth, wastewater, again, on an annual average basis, the plant capacity is 730 cubic meters a day. That approval document actually does have a peak rating listed, as well as some approval documents do, some don't. But again, evaluating performance really on an average day basis, your current average day flows there a little over 400 cubic meters a day. Same comment as Wingham, you got to look at what the actual loadings and concentrations are, but similar for this system. Viewing reserve on the basis of flow alone is we think pretty suitable. This is a little different from the Wingham wastewater plan in the sense that by the time you take your existing flows of 406, your commitments represent 107 cubic meters a day. Leaves you with an uncommitted reserve of 217, or about 30% of the plant capacity, and that would be, oh, the text is cut off there where it says additional 259. That should be 259 equivalent residential units there in your uncommitted reserve. So we think you're in pretty good shape there. There have been times that peak flows have been a concern for the plant there. I guess our experience has been that's hard to completely avoid at most communities in southwestern Ontario. Almost every system has a little bit of proneness to peak flows in wet weather conditions, and it's hard to avoid entirely. kind of chip away at it again as sewers get rehabilitated and that kind of work goes on. So I don't think it's anything to get too excited about. So this is just really a summary slide for Wingham. For water treatment, again, if you're assuming full utilization of the cross-border servicing, full development of A2A and Hutton Heights. For water, even after all that those commitments are assumed to be fully used on a water basis, you're still close to 1,300 equivalent residential units capacity-wise available. But for wastewater, it's just under 100. So yeah, when the time comes, dealing with your wastewater plant capacity would be the driver well before you have to do anything for water. And then even if there does come a day that you need more water, some of the simple ways to deal with that would just be to put a second well on the site and treat that as a standby kind of thing. So we think you're in pretty good shape on the water supply. It's the water storage that requires more attention there. And summary for Blyth, kind of a reversal of Wingham in the sense that it would be water that needs to be dealt with well before the wastewater plant would need to be dealt with there. But even having said that, I think it's still going to be a number of years off before you have to do anything significant on the water supply and treatment side of things.
Great. Backing up a little bit to the summary of Wingham and regarding the wastewater, to Sean, where are we in the storm water drainage? Do we have any, or?
Through you, Reeve. I think that's probably one of the big drivers as far as the peak number that he and Ross had to work with. We certainly do see a lot of infiltration in the system, which skews the numbers, I think.
Yeah, that combined sewer concept of your sewer handling the both storm and sanitary flows, very commonly done decades ago. But anytime that you did a street reconstruction, you would be separating them now. Anytime you have a development, you'd be looking at stormwater management facilities specifically. So it's there. Over time, I think you chip away at it. It's very hard to hit it aggressively and to fix it all in a short window of time. It's tough to do.
But Anita,
For the Hutton Heights and the A2A development, did you use the same numbers for wastewater treatment as that are now used? Or did you calculate in that they will have stormwater management? So they will be separated there?
Yeah, good question. No, we use the same number that is currently used. So you're right, you would expect that
Will
number
be lower
to
then.
drop off. Good question.
very good question.
Saved you some percentage.
You're all set.
You're good. We're good to go.
I guess the other one, more to Kevin, the Rutledge, like Reeve, you asked about the extra homes for the Rutledge, and you said it's property adjoining or nearby, behind it?
Oh, the extra homes that are there?
Yeah, that's potential. I was wondering, is that North Huron or Morris? North Huron, okay.
I think that did take me
And
into
put
what
in storm sewer, so.
Yeah.
that's all I plan to talk to you about, but I'm more than happy if you had other questions about this or the master plan project in general.
Any other questions from council? Seeing none, any questions from staff? Good?
I'd say one comment that
Yes.
came to mind. So I worked at a water storage plant in you get in between Brantford and Brantford. And the underwater underground storage was the high school football field.
Oh, really?
Just put sod over top, or dirt and sod. And
Cool. Cool. Well, Andrew, we want to thank you very much for coming out and presenting this to us. Gives us lots to think about.
Sure.
It does sound like we're in pretty good shape for the next decade anyway, provided we take care of the standpipe here in the Wingham ward. I would say that would be a fair assessment of what you brought forward, wouldn't it?
Yep, for your treatment needs, that's what we're seeing as well.
Mhm.
Don't want to get ahead of myself, but I'm assuming we'll be seeing each other again in the upcoming months as kind of the rest of the master plan unfolds. So we'll talk about some of the other sort of asset management related items with that. But I would agree on the whole treatment basis that we're not seeing anything very negative here right now.
Just one, I just thought of one curious question. I believe the Wingham standpipe has been talked about. We've been gonna fix it for going back with your company. How far? 20 years, 30 years?
Well, there was some, well before my time, I think it would have been the early to mid 90s. There was some assessment work and some rehabilitation work done back then. Don't quote me on that time frame, but I think that's about right. Maybe even the early 2000s.
I think that's what it says on the standpipe, 2000 something.
Is that what it says?
Did a lot of furbishment.
Okay. Might have started in the mid 90s, and by the time it was actually completed, it might have been that.
So we've been basically doctoring this up for a while then, right, Paul?
Just don't let it fall, please.
You're a good swimmer.
is it at full capacity, or did they drop the water level?
I think you're still operating close to the top capacity there, and you wouldn't if you changed that, you wouldn't change it very much before you did start to get into some pressure issues in the area right around there.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, is there any new technological advancement in wastewater treatment? Like, I know on farms, they do all the biodigesters and stuff like that. Is it happening for wastewater plants too, or is it too liquid?
So certainly technology is always changing. We don't really advocate for being guinea pigs with that kind of stuff. We like things that are proven, but your systems are old enough that technology will have changed. And a big driver for the technology change is that someday when it comes that you do need to expand one of those plants, the Ministry of Environment gets involved in that process early on. They will say, okay, you want to put more discharge out, but you're going to have to treat it a lot better because we don't want the overall contaminant loading to be any higher than it is right now. So yeah, you can put more flow out, you just got to treat it better. And it's that need to treat it better that drives the equipment and technology providers to advance their products.
So maybe in 15 or 20 years, when we need to expand our capacity, will be something available to have different treatments. So you don't need to get larger, but more compact.
I can almost guarantee that the treatment processes that are implemented would change, even if it was today, not even 10 or 20 years from now, it would be a little bit different than what's there now.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We appreciate you coming out.
My pleasure, thank you.
We're going to go down now to 5 reports, 5.1, the OPS 2019-23 Wingham standpipe options. Sean, did you want to speak to that first?
Yes, if you don't mind.
Yeah, you will just wait for him, yeah.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, no, take your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Reeve. Actually, this whole thing laid out quite nicely because I think a lot of the questions that were asked of Andrew and answered are things that we'll be discussing now. And I think it might be important to note that to date, this is potentially the most expensive decision that council may have to make. So this is a fairly big one. I'm going to stick fairly close to the script, and please stop me if there's any questions, or if you're unclear on anything. So basically, as was mentioned, now the standpipe we have was constructed in '74. The major rehab and reconstruction took place in '84, and they identified some issues with it at that time. And then from that point, there's been additional work done on it. In 2015, Burnside was hired to complete an audit of the standpipe, and through their audit, they noted a few things. Now, I should just, for the benefit of anybody that's not aware of the type of standpipe that we have, it's even though it's clad in sheet steel, it's actually a concrete tube standing upright. And of course, the water pressure associated with that system basically dictates that concrete in and of itself isn't strong enough. So what they do is they have, and you'll see if you read the report, references to pre-tensioning bands. So at the top, there's steel bands that go around it, and they're tensioned. So they're holding that concrete in and under pressure to combat the pressure of the water inside. As you move down the structure, the spacing between these bands becomes tighter and tighter and tighter, because obviously at the bottom the pressures are very high. So one of the things that that really concerned Burnside when they went in and looked at it is they saw spalling, and they saw some of these pre-tensioning bands were actually exposed and rusting. So the concern is that as the structure degrades, some of these bands become compromised. They're no longer applying stress or pressure inward, which puts additional pressure on the other bands. And as you can see, it becomes kind of an expanding problem in that the pressures kind of escalate through the area where the bands have failed. So what they did is, in the report, they offered three short-term solutions. Well, three solutions, not all of them short-term. The first option that they suggested was reducing the overall operating level. And I think that question just came up a few minutes ago. Are we running at a reduced level? The quick answer is no. We weren't able to do that because, as Andrew had talked about earlier, the pressure in the system is dependent on the height of that standpipe. So, their idea was reduce the pressure, reduce the level, reduces the pressure at the bottom where the bands are compromised or potentially compromised. And that kind of helps you limp through. The problem is right across the street, you've got a two-story facility, specifically the hospital. So if you lower that level, you end up lowering pressure for that, basically the whole area that's at the higher elevation in town. So it was very quickly deemed as non-viable. You would be starting to encroach on that 20 PSI recommended minimum pressure issue. The possibility of causing problems for the second floor of the hospital, it was certainly an issue. So that option really didn't work at the time. It was determined that they just couldn't do that. Now, the other option was a complete external strengthening of the existing standpipe until, and they said this in the report, until a replacement standpipe is constructed. Yes, this is viable, but this is a case where you're going to apply fairly significant levels of funding to a Band-Aid, a short-term Band-Aid solution. So obviously that's not something that has come before council and that's been considered. The third option that they brought forward is really the fix for the existing, and that was a major rehabilitation of the existing standpipe. So basically what they were suggesting is all the steel cladding and insulation be stripped off, standpipe be emptied, all of the loose or spalled material inside and out be chipped away, any pre-tensioning bands that have been compromised be chipped out and replaced, reconsolidating the structure with new concrete where it was chipped away, repainting and repair inside. So as you can see, just talking through it, you're into an extremely expensive rehabilitation. The concerning part, and it was something that was mentioned in the report, is until you've peeled everything back, you really don't know what you're looking at. So this is a project that potentially could vortex out of control in terms of its costs. And the other thing that was mentioned in the report from Burnside is that would address the current condition, but it doesn't really provide a long-term resolution. It doesn't speak to, okay, now that you've done this, you've got an additional 35 years. You just don't know what you've got. It fixes the problem today. So that being said, my predecessor looked at these options and he introduced council to the concept of an EA, which would help them walk through this whole process and decision. What I'm hoping to achieve today is basically, as all but one on this is new to this, this will basically, in a sense, reset the clock, get all the information in front of council, and either we go into the EA or perhaps we don't. Not all of the options associated with repair or addressing this issue require an EA process. So I'll walk through those options, and this then becomes a bit of a watershed decision point. So it's quite important in the sense that it'll set the course for what we do next and how quickly we can move.
What's EA stand for?
Environmental assessment. So basically, just to simplify it, if we're doing something different, so if we're going to an elevated storage tank, if we're going to an in-ground storage tank, if we're moving the existing structure, anything that shows a significant change in the current operation would require this whole environmental assessment process be gone through so that everything's considered. If we were looking at either replacement of the existing structure with a like structure or repair of the existing structure, there's no EA. You can actually then step into the process of engineering, go ahead and do the work. And I'm not saying that to try to lead council in one direction or another, but just to know that that's why today's so important. We brought part of the master servicing plan was this whole to have them work through this EA. And as Andrew and I worked through it, we got to the point where we kind of stalled. Said, okay, well, without knowing what the desired council is, we don't know whether we move forward with the EA, which is a costly undertaking, or do we go in a different direction and start engineering? So we're hoping to, although I'm certainly not going to press council for a decision today on this. This introduces the topic and we can move forward with it. So that being said, the options that
Chris has a question if you
Oh,
don't
sorry.
mind.
Through you, Reeve. How expensive is a typical EA? Are they all vary?
It varies depending on complexity, but this one I believe wasn't it in the $60,000 range for a standalone EA. Now that's been rolled into the master servicing plan. So, but it can be a very costly undertaking depending on complexity. There's public engagement, there's pre-engineering, there's a lot of site investigations and all that kind of thing.
And as I will reiterate, an EA process, once you get through the EA process, that EA process determines the course of action. And you have a specific limit. Like you have 10 years to complete that.
So your options
are limited. Like once the process has gone through, the decision is made by council, EA process kicks in, you don't put this on the shelf and do another one in 10 years. You are required by the ministry to have it on and accepted by that day. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's the process that we were doing originally for the house and dam. That was the process. But that process was stopped in the prior council. But that was the process, that we would have to make a decision. And then once we made that decision, we'd have 10 years to figure out how to plan and pay for it accordingly. Similar to this process.
So the next step was an EA for the previous council, and you stopped at that point.
Right, there was other decisions that were made because of that process,
Okay.
but the fundamentally part of an EA process is the public engagement, the firm takes over and puts your interests in mind with regards to public consultation, costs, all the things that are relative in options. And then council gets all in a nice little neat package and says, here you go, make your decision. oh, but by the way, once you make that decision, here's the number, and you got 10 years to do it. That's the typical process.
If there is a replacement standpipe, do you have to build the same size or can it be smaller? Because as we just saw, there is a lot of capacity there. Does it have to be that big or can it be smaller?
We have some flexibility through you, Reed. We, as long as it's another standpipe being built on the same footprint, there is some flexibility in terms of subtle design changes, whether you want more inventory, less inventory. Again, addition of booster systems, that sort of thing, but it's still in the same footprint. So at this point, it looks like we would not be required to go through that.
Okay, and do you have to do repairs to the existing standpipe while you're doing a replacement? Or is the existing still good for 15 years or 10 years?
Personal thought, I think 15 years would be stretching it, most assuredly. We have, because I had concerns when I looked at the engineering report from RJ Burnside. Veolia joined me, we had meetings with them, and we said, none of the options you've given us are operationally viable in the immediate. So we're in the process of working through a monitoring program that will allow us to confirm that there's no imminent, and we don't believe that there's imminent risk. That would have been embedded in the report. If Burnside thought that that thing was a threat to the community, we wouldn't even be having this conversation.
Yeah.
Burnside's concern was it's not getting better with time. So there's things we should do to monitor it while we figure out what the next steps are. And so that whole monitoring program, we have a couple of things in mind, and Veolia, Burnside, and staff are working on implementing those things in the short term.
So are there any grants or anything available as far as you know, or is that just not available, or is it maybe in the future because a lot of communities are struggling with their water supply?
I will touch on that later, but at this point in time, we're not aware of anything that would provide any sort of financial assistance. So now just to jump back, the options that we believe are appropriate to bring before council today are, first off, and we have to consider all options, with the exception that doing nothing in this particular case is not a viable or an acceptable option, just based on the engineering report. So the real options that we have are, as we discussed briefly, major rehab of the existing standpipe, and we just spoke to that. Replacement of the standpipe with a similar structure on the same parcel of land. Construction of an elevated storage tank, which is something Andrew had spoken of. It should be noted that that option cannot be considered on the existing footprint. It's physically too big. You picture, use Listowel as an example. You've got that concrete column that's basically the size of what we have, which is empty. You got the tank up there, which would overshadow the
Houses on
the houses. Yeah, it's quite large.
I'm sure that'd be enjoyable.
And even in the long term, even if, by some miracle, everybody in the neighborhood said, that's fine, let's do it.
You're talking about a mushroom.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Paul is not going to say it's fine.
Paul's not gonna say it. That being said, then maintenance down the road becomes virtually impossible because those things do require stripping, painting, that sort of thing. So 15, 20 years from now, you're trying to work over top of somebody's property, pulling paint and that sort of thing off. So if elevated storage, which is operationally a wonderful option, is to be considered, we have to find land in proximity. That's where you're really getting to the thick of the EA process. And then the last option that we think is appropriate, and Andrew did touch on this, is complete elimination of standpipe in favor of a pressure system. So basically what we do is we build a big old reservoir. It's typically in ground, as mentioned, under a football field, but location, this is part of an EA process. Location comes in, or the location is a big consideration, big factor. Operationally, and this is where Andrew mentioned a few times, different operators have different opinions on it. I personally operated these systems and they work wonderfully. The issue is that that type of system is completely and immediately dependent on your available hydropower. So They always have an associated standby generator system. As hydro goes out, there has to be immediate transfer because in the absence of hydro, your pressure stops now. The difference is whether it's elevated storage or standpipe, even if, like our existing system where we're only using that top piece and as you go down, pressure drops, you still have the benefit of that time to address the issue. So that's something to keep in mind. The storage, in-ground storage is a wonderful system, except it is completely dependent on power.
So Sean, you said you have that amount of time because of that, and that would be a concern of mine all of a sudden, especially with the hospital right there. When you say you have amount of time, how much time? Are we talking 3 days? Or are we talking an hour? If all of a sudden, right now, the hydro went out and we have that tank sitting there based on what we're using, are we talking a week or a day?
You're talking hours. And again, very much dependent on where the level was when the power went out and what the demand is. It's probably 31 out there with a humidex of 37 right now. If that standpipe is already at the lower end, which is typical, on these hot days, pumps are working hard, people are demanding water, the level tends to migrate down. If the power went out now, first off, there's a big demand and your pressures are already dropping. So you'll see at the higher elevations, you would see a problem right away. Wintertime, several hours.
What do we have now?
You've got just an elevated storage tank now.
No generator?
No generator, no booster pumps, no nothing. So your pressure is dependent on the volume that's in there, in that system. And as you go down, you can draw that whole volume down, but by the time you get below the start set point in the standpipe, now your higher elevation homes are starting to feel it. The pressures are low.
They're not gonna see the pressure coming out of the taps.
You'll get to the point actually with the standpipe, and especially with the elevation changes in the community, the standpipe could be virtually empty. The houses at the top of the hill have no water. Somebody down on this end of town at a lower elevation still has water because they're pulling from the system.
Does the hospital has a generator,
And
do they have a
booster pumps.
pump? So they can suck in and give themselves pressure then?
It's my understanding that they have booster pumps to aid with that second floor. Now, I can't confirm that, but that's what I was told, that they do have a booster system. The difference being with the elevated storage tank, all of your inventory is up top. So you really, when the highest customer runs out of water, the lowest guy is right behind him. Because the water's gone. And the other piece is, as Andrew had mentioned, modifying a standpipe like we have here, whether it's a new one or this one, with a booster system then allows you to electrically pull that whole inventory as well. So there are these new technologies, these hybrid systems that give you the benefits of the best of both worlds. So again, as you can see,
I just got a question. Go ahead first, Trev.
My question is more, so if it wasn't viable to take the pressure down operationally. What do you do in the case where you want to put something on the same footprint? Like if it's not operationally viable to take it down,
can't empty it.
how are we going to empty it to remove it to put something else in the same property?
Because you guys approved a PRV for the system. Part of the budget process last year, we brought that PRV for the well systems.
Okay.
The VFD. Getting my acronyms wrong, but variable frequency drive. So, and that's being installed. If it isn't in now, it's within the next week or so.
Yeah.
Basically what that does is it allows Veolia to shut that standpipe off and use the wells to ramp up pressure or drop pressure down. See, normally a pump is all on or all off, right? And that's why we don't use them alone. They blow every pipe out of the ground if they're running and there's no demand. The VFD will look at system pressure and speed the pumps up, slow the pumps down. We could take that offline indefinitely to do whatever we had to do, and they would just run off both systems.
So we have a pressure system right now then, or will have.
In essence,
Yeah.
except the system that we have doesn't have that reserve capacity. So if we isolate that standpipe, run on the VFDs,
And a spike comes.
they'll be fine. They'll handle that spike, but if we lost something, we don't have that inventory in the ground that's gonna carry us. So it's, you're slightly exposed, but we do have redundancy in the system. That was part of that whole budget process was we had a VFD on one pump, we would need it on both so that you had the ability to use everything you had.
So where I wanted to go with that one, just before we move on then, is you're recommending or they're recommending to use the same system we're using in Blyth now. Would that be right? Or Wingham?
Well, that's one option is something similar to Blyth where you drive through Blyth, you don't see the standpipe that says Blyth.
Yeah.
It's not there.
Yeah.
Because they've got the inventory in a tank in the ground
Yeah.
and the pumps are running. Yeah, you're entirely dependent on your grid. So if you lose power and it's not just a generator, my opinion may creep through here, but it's not just reliance on the generator, it's reliance on the transfer switch as well. So you've got, with any of these systems, you've got a transfer switch that's watching grid power, making sure everything's fine. As soon as you lose a leg or there's a problem with frequency or voltage, it says not good enough, switches over and starts the generator and transfers. It's been my experience that often the generators do wonderfully. It's the transfer switch that fails. So it's just, if council elected to go that route, you just have to be cognizant of the fact that it is an energy and technology dependent solution. It's not a bad solution. It's just, it is there.
Blythe runs off of diesel once the power goes out.
Mhm.
You have to manually,
Yeah,
I think you still have to go manually reset it after that.
In Blythe's case, yeah, it's actually a diesel pump. It's not even a transfer. It just, as soon as it senses the pressure drop, it starts this big old pump that starts pushing.
So the maintenance for the pressure system will be way more expensive than for standpipe. Like electricity,
Tricky quite through you, Reef. It depends on what you went with. If you went with elevated storage, there's not
yeah, like what we have now, if you
what you have
compare that,
now.
compare that with the pressure system.
Yes, of course,
Will
you're
be more expensive.
maintaining those things. But if we went to a system like we have now with booster pumps, then
Oh, that would be the same.
Yeah. no matter what, I don't think any of the options in my mind have there's no magic bullet that's going to save money in terms of
No, I'm looking at maintenance, like
Yeah.
year
year
cost
on year.
that you have to put to your taxpayers.
Yeah.
because of-
I don't think any system is significantly better, like obviously you'd have your annual diesel checks and that sort of thing, but you're talking
Yeah.
$2,500,
Yeah,
that sort of thing. It's not.
thank you.
So, as mentioned, in order to advance this project, we need to get a couple of decisions made. First off, I think I went through all of the steps that are required under major rehab, which was the first option. And I am going to quote something here. And this is out of the Burnside report, these recommendations are aimed at extending the life of the structure as much as possible. However, it is extremely difficult to ascertain the quantifiable value for the extension of life provided by these repairs. That's out of the Burnside report. And that in and of itself may be cause for concern. And as I mentioned, we don't know what the cost for that rehab would be. Could be reasonably affordable in the overall scheme of things. You won't know until you've peeled all the steel and the insulation back and started sounding all the concrete. So that one, they really couldn't give us an idea of what we're looking at, what we're looking at for cost. So then if we move on to the replacement options, again, we got pressurized system, elevated storage tank at an alternate site, and construction of a replacement standpipe on the existing site. So is everybody fairly clear on the three? I think we've kind of got to death. The pressurized system is an in-ground tank. Standpipe is what we have. Elevated storage would be something similar to Listowel, probably a little further down the street maybe, but we'd have to find a different location. So that's the three options outside of the repair. The only thing, and I did mention it before, is that the EA process is not likely required if we go to a replacement standpipe, which moves things. Actually, the project becomes very quick, funding availability notwithstanding. So then as far as financial impact, we did do a fair bit of, I met with a firm that does standpipe replacement at our site to determine the viability of the project. And the budget numbers that were given to BM Ross and passed on to us for demolition of the existing standpipe, replacement of the standpipe, in this case, they were citing a glass fused one, so it's steel with glass fused surface, no painting required. Including a generator, booster pump, all the bells and whistles, you're looking at $3,412,000 as far as a budget price. If you're looking at elevated storage, that doesn't count the demolition costs or the land purchase. You're about $4.2 million plus applicable taxes just for the construction of the new one. Estimate about $100,000 because we had got preliminary pricing for demo. Estimate $100,000 for the demolition, and then of course, if the land's available, you're purchasing it at market price. And we did a little bit of preliminary work without getting into too many details on it. There may be land potentially available. The doors weren't slammed shut, so it's not, at this point, it's not an option that is unavailable to council. At least we don't believe it is. And then I did not develop a price for a pressure system because there's so many variables, where it's going to be built, the size of the building or the unit, what kind of buildings required, the pumping. Because again, pressure system isn't relying on the well pumps. Well pumps put the water into the tank. The tank has its own treatment facility on top of it that has the pumps, that has a standby generator, that has a transfer switch, the MCC. So we didn't price that option. If that's something council wants to see, we can do our best to do to get pricing, but there will be a little bit of engineering work required to really nail that.
But do you know where that would fit in between the two of them, or like, you must have a guesstimate?
Well, that one we could possibly put down where the wells are. We could potentially put it where the standpipe is. There's a couple of options with that one. And again, there's a little bit of heavy lifting to really nail down the pricing on that.
Still in the millions, obviously.
Oh, yeah, you're
Big
still,
millions.
because you're buying all that equipment as well, you're still into a fairly expensive undertaking. So then, I should note that a project of this magnitude exceeds the water reserve fund. There's currently about 2.5 million in that fund. But that 2.5 was from contributions from all three wards. Like that's all your water funds into that. So it's not just a wing fund from that perspective.
Go ahead, Chris.
Reeve, it's part of that 2.5 million, were we gonna use some of that to run water out to Hutton?
We haven't made that decision yet, but we do have
But that's
some
a
big
pot
ticket
that we would
items.
take.
Yes, we have some big ticket items.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Go ahead.
Is there any of these options that don't require the EAA?
standpipe, the
The
replacement of the existing standpipe or the rehab of the standpipe do not require the
But the in-ground would.
The in-ground definitely does, and of course the elevated storage is no question.
That adds almost 100,000 to it right there.
It potentially, well, it certainly would drive the engineering costs on the front end. So given the high cost of, for any of these options and the current level of reserves, in talking with our treasurer, we don't believe that the council has any alternative but to borrow a significant portion for the funds required for this project. And again, I do have to stress that, and we did touch on this before, for the sake of the public, the Burnside report was not implying that there was an imminent risk of failure. I think that's important. You know, we don't want the general public thinking that we're taking their time working through something that started in 2015. You know, and we are implementing a couple of options to monitor its status as we move through 2019 and on.
So I want to throw it there right off the bat. We have some big ticket items. Could we look at a situation, Donna, where we could put this in our budget and say, budget $200,000 each year over 5 years to work towards this? And I don't care what the numbers are, but so that we hit a certain point where we say, okay, now we can borrow and we're comfortable, because it is a big ticket item. It has been going for a while. There's not an imminent threat of anything. Having said that, I mean, this is our drinking water. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, certainly, you're not gonna get out of borrowing, at the end. And we'd have to review, part of what we need to do is to know what other decisions you're gonna make on other pieces, because there's only so much money, so we know that. So for sure, we would be starting to put money away for it. The other thing that we could do, as Andrew explained to you this morning, part of what he's doing is a rate study. So, whether or not right now we're collecting $15 a month for reserves. So perhaps as part of our discussions on rates, we may have to up that as well for the next few years, so that until we get more money put away for it. But definitely we have to budget for it, borrow some money, and look at the rates. And if there's any grant money that does come available, Sean and I worked on with BM Ross. We did put in a big application back last year for the elevated storage. And so we put that in for a big grant, and then they pulled the grant after we had submitted it, and nobody got any grant money. So we'd certainly be looking at every dollar every available dollar in order to finance this thing, for sure. So which will include putting money away each year, yes.
So I'm going to switch it back over to you, Sean. If you don't, go ahead, Kevin, you go first.
Just a clarification, if money was used, if that 2.5 was used, you just borrow it from yourself, do you not? Like, we'd just be borrowing that portion of it from the reserve, and then we'd be paying ourselves back, wouldn't we not?
Well, the 2.5 would be gone.
Yeah, but
It'd be-
as a loan, it would be, it'd be as a loan, wouldn't it, where the town, like, we would have to pay that back to ourselves?
Well, no, it would be gone, like, the 2.5 we have sitting in the bank today, but it's came from Blyth, East Squamish, and Wingham. So to pay the contractor, we'd have that 2.5 would be gone out of the bank, and then we would have to borrow the difference from external. Unless we felt, depending on what other decisions you make, but it's most likely we'd be borrowing from Infrastructure Ontario,
So
not from ourselves.
What I was saying
Kevin, I'll
was with
follow
that
up on that, because I know where you're going with that, because I had the same question. So what happens what we've been doing in the past is something besides water and that we need to do a structure. So we're borrowing the money from the water and the PUC to do something that has nothing to do with the PUC. That's when you hear Donna say we have to pay that back to the PUC. But this is the PUC for the PUC. So we just eat that money up and it's gone. But if we wanted to buy a grader, let's say, and instead of borrowing the money at 6% at the bank, we would borrow from ourselves. And I think that's what you're thinking. Yeah.
And that 2.5 would eventually be paid back.
Yeah, and the work department would have to pay that back to the water, but this is actually the water money, and it's there for to replace the water, so that money would disappear. I just want to ask a quick question for Elise, and then I'm gonna go to you, Trevor. So could we make this a shovel-ready project? So we're ready to go, because I've heard this at different places I've been to where something comes along and you're not ready for it, therefore Exeter got the grant or what. So could we make this a shovel-ready project moving forward then, so we can also look at the grants that we're all talking about? Go ahead, Sean.
Yes, thank you, Reeve. This actually, if I direct you to the resolution, this might help move the process.
Okay.
As staff in consultation with BM Ross, and through internal discussions, we thought it prudent to at least put a recommendation in front of council, because that gives you the opportunity to either work with that or go elsewhere, go in another direction. So really the resolution in front of council is further that staff be authorized to proceed with the development of a detailed work plan and the investigation of funding options for the construction of a replacement standpipe on the existing site through the master servicing plan project. So in essence, in answering your question, from a staff perspective, we're recommending Standpipe on the existing, which eliminates the EA. And because we're no longer dealing with the EA process, we can use the resources that were applied to the master servicing plan to get that shovel-ready project, to do the engineering and get tender documents ready. So that when council wants us to proceed or when the funding is in place, we can pull the trigger on it.
I'm gonna go to Trevor and then over to Anita.
I'm trying to remember what I was gonna ask.
Well, Anita, go ahead.
Anita. Go ahead, Anita.
For bringing water towards Hutton Heights, those costs, can we recover those from the development cost, or is it just money out of the water funds reserve
This,
that we put into there?
at this point through URI, the DCs were established and included work on the force main. Nothing to do at this point with Hutton Heights. So I don't believe, we certainly couldn't do anything with DCs at this point in time.
Yeah, so my comment is that the 2.5 million, we have to understand that fund also utilizes road work. So anything, I'm assuming that if you do a reconstruction of a road, you're not just taking all out of roads, there's water reserves that you're pulling, like the water main, so we can't be just depleting. I think we have to figure out what the optimal level of that reserve needs to be to continue work in the future in both Blyth, East, and Wingham, for road replacement, because we don't want to have all of a sudden now have to wait 5 or 10 years to fix a road that should be fixed yesterday or 2 years ago, because that's how the funding works when you're doing a complete road work. Correct me if I'm wrong, Sean.
Approximately, depends on the particular project and the complexity of the underground infrastructure, but say for argument's sake, 50% of the cost is often attributed to water and sanitary.
Right.
Go ahead, Rick.
If we replace the standpipe, how many years would we get out of it?
Through you, Reeve, the new standpipes, especially if you went to one of these hybrid steel glass lined ones, you can expect 50 years plus on the structure.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, I'm going to read the motion that the Council Township of North Huron hereby received the report from the Director of Public Works dated June 17, 2019 regarding the replacement of the Wingham standpipe for information. And further, the staff be authorized to proceed with the development of a detailed work plan and investigations of funding options for the construction of a replacement standpipe on the existing site through the Master Servicing Plan project. Do I have a mover? I have Christopher. Seconded by Paul. Last chance for questions or comments. Seeing none, I call the vote. All in favor? Carries. Thank you, Sean. 5.2, I believe, is still you, Sean?
Yes, thank you, Reeve. And I'll stick very close to the script on this one. The purpose of this report is there's been a lot of discussion surrounding the existing Morris Turnberry cross-border servicing. The purpose of this report is to just kind of lay some of the framework out for council so that as we move into further discussions surrounding that agreement, the hope would be that everybody would be on the same page and understand the agreement itself and what it was designed to establish. So forgive me if I basically read off the report here, but North Huron has constructed the infrastructure necessary to provide potable water and sanitary sewer services to properties within the urban areas of the township. Due to the geographic configuration of the township, it is common to see development in neighboring municipalities adjacent to our borders. This includes both Morris Turnberry and Central to a certain extent. In the majority of cases, property owners in the neighboring municipalities consider it advantageous to utilize the water and sanitary services that were constructed by North Huron for township use. Cross-border servicing agreements are a common tool used to establish the terms, the conditions, and costings associated with property owners in neighboring municipalities connecting to North Huron infrastructure. In 2015, North Huron Council adopted a cross-border servicing policy. And so we're going to talk about both the policy and the agreement. They're two different animals. The policy establishes North Huron's framework for agreements with other municipalities. The most recent versions of these documents, of course, are appended to the package. So just, again, stepping off the script, as we talk through these, it's important to keep in mind that the North Huron cross-border servicing policy is our own tool. It's a document that was constructed so that as we, the Township of North Huron, decide we want to provide these services, staff can look to the policy and say, okay, make sure we do this, and this. So it's just an internal document, and it's very easy to get the two or start crossing the wires on both of them. The agreement should mirror the policy. You know, if we followed our own policies in the development of the agreement, the two will read very, very similar, and the things that you see in the agreement, you'll know came from the policy. So now, without belaboring that, we'll talk about the agreement itself. So the existing cross-border servicing agreement with Morris Turnberry, this thing predates amalgamation. In 2004, the first formal agreement between the Township of North Huron and the municipality of Morris Turnberry was adopted through Bylaw 31, 2004. It was a 5-year agreement, and actually, when you look at it, it was very limited in detail. It included, but was not limited to, one-time frontage and capital charges, and established some rates for service, which were set at 1.5 times what a North Huron resident would pay. Capacity was not assigned in the initial agreement. So basically, somebody could tie in. They didn't have to tell North Huron how much they needed. They just said, I'm plugging in. So it really did focus more on the cost component. This agreement was negotiated and renewed both in 2010 and 2014. The renewed agreements provided additional clarification, and you could see it growing over time, so that there was additional clauses that were put in. The most recent version of the agreement was adopted through bylaw number 41, 2017. Now, there was an administrative amendment to that agreement, which was done in 2018 under bylaw 99, 2018. The administrative amendment affects schedules A and B, as well as schedule F, and it introduced a new schedule, which was G. So schedules A and B specify the properties being serviced and the maximum allowable capacity assignment for each respective property. So when you look at the document, every single location, every single property that's tied into North Huron is identified very specifically. Not only is it identified, but it says how much they're allowed to take. And then of course the costings associated are built off of that. And that's A is for water, B is for sanitary sewer. Every time there's an amendment, it comes back to council for review and discussion again before that property is added. Schedule G provided clarification surrounding the termination clause and provided some assurances that existing service properties outside North Huron borders would continue to be serviced should the agreement be terminated. As always, North Huron approval would be required for new service connections. And then Schedule F speaks to the partnership agreement between the two municipalities and outlines specific financial contributions for soft services. It also speaks to taxation sharing by mutual consent. So that's the agreement in a nutshell, and we'll get into some details on that. Now let's go back and talk about that North Huron policy. So in 2014, the cross-border servicing policy was developed and adopted by council through bylaw number 52, 2014. The policy was established for the purpose of clarifying the financial requirements associated with cross-border servicing. It outlined all fees and charges associated with cross-border servicing agreements. It's noteworthy that this policy also included a taxation sharing requirement, which called for an annual payment to North Huron equaling 30% of the municipal taxes of all properties receiving cross-border servicing. As noted above, the policy was developed and adopted by North Huron Council. It appeared that implementation of this policy would occur during the negotiation process of cross-border servicing agreement. Now, that policy, which was adopted in 2014, was superseded by a revised cross-border servicing policy the next year. So in 2015, it was superseded. The revised policy, enacted by bylaw number 55, 2015, was developed to provide a general summary to the township's requirements for those seeking to obtain water and sanitary services from the municipality. The policy removed the 30% taxation requirement in favor of taxation revenue sharing. The policy reads that the taxation revenue sharing portion would be set at a mutually agreed upon level, and the amount collected would be in addition to the annual contributions towards soft services. Based on staff's review, the provision of the 2015 cross-border servicing policy was never exercised.
That's an issue.
What was that, Chris? I didn't hear.
That was an issue. Like, they came up with a 30% taxation sharing, and then it never happened.
Well, to qualify, that 2014 policy that was developed internally spoke to the 30%. Sorry, through your review. The 2015 got rid of the 30.
There you go.
And what it said is by mutual agreement, but then it also laid down a funding agreement for soft services. And like to qualify that with respect to the soft services, the policy made reference to several services that we as North Huron provide, which included but were not limited to recreation, cemeteries, libraries, daycare service, airport, and ECDEV. What you'll find when you look from the policy into the agreement, and again, as I said earlier, arguably one would use our own policy to develop the agreement. Not all of those services are included in that Schedule F, which speaks to the soft services. So
if I can just touch on that and just correct me if anybody that can help me out. So when I was on council in 2014, and we did that, we were getting $60,000 or $70,000 a year from Morris Turnberry towards the arenas and different projects. That was already in place. The 30% was then added on after negotiations. But my understanding is the 30% disappeared, so we're getting what we always got traditionally. So we didn't gain anything with 30%.
But we could have though, we're getting the soft service help from them, and they should anyways, because their people are utilizing these services. So when I read 30% tax sharing on, because they are right there and they're utilizing our services, it only made sense.
Mhm.
And that's something that we're going to be talking about requiring or asking for today. I'm hoping that we bring that back to make things fair. So it just boggled me that we dropped it.
And I'm gonna be honest about this. We weren't sitting on that council, so we don't know what happened. And one thing life will teach you is fella has an accident, and the guy standing off says, I would have turned to the right or I'd have turned to the left, but when the accident's happening, you just may not think of that. So in all fairness to previous councils, everybody has tried very hard, and there probably were reasons, and we'll maybe get into that. Moving forward, I think Sean's going to speak to that a little further, and we're all going to speak to it. But yes, as the person that was there for the hard negotiations to the 30%, it was hard negotiations. Having said that, I'm understanding there was an escape clause which they could use or whatever. So we're just going to keep moving forward with this right now. Okay. And I just wanted to be fair to Morris Turnberry that we are getting $70,000 a year from them towards. So it's not like there's nothing. So
yeah, so And again, once we get later into the meeting, this next part might help at least frame what the agreement looks like for those that haven't sat down and pored over it. So there's a number of headings within the agreement. The first one, of course, is general, just the general terms. This section outlines the structure of the agreement, the purpose of the various schedules. It identifies the primary contact personnel as well as the resources available, and establishes the authority of North Huron as absolute in the assignment and approval process. North Huron's ownership of the infrastructure as well as responsibility for maintenance is established. So then the next area is water servicing. That's again, as I touched on earlier, that's Schedule A. Adherence to the water capacity allowances identified in Schedule A are absolutely required. There's a requirement for metering and a prohibition for cross connection, which is spoke to. There's also a whole section on leak detection, which is quite interesting, as well as access for maintenance. When you get into the next heading, it's wastewater, and again, it talks to adherence to the maximum capacity allowed in Schedule B. There's some language clarifying the manner with which sanitary sewage flows are calculated. Strict prohibition surrounding foundation and roof drains, which is nice to know, is in there. So again, the cross-border servicing agreement doesn't allow that cross connection that we talked about earlier with Andrew, which is huge. And then, of course, it does speak to access for maintenance. Financial section references rates and all the rates and service connection fees and everything are found in Schedule C of the agreement. It talks about a reference to the infrastructure recovery fee for water and sanitary sewer, in addition to the out-of-boundary surcharge of 150% for water and sewer, plus the connection fees. The general section again gets into some of the weeds surrounding it, so it addresses the numerous administrative functions associated with the agreement. It includes a requirement for each municipality to enforce a sewer use bylaw, and speaks to indemnification for North Huron. The arbitration process and determination clause are found in this section. The agreement is designed to automatically renew with certain criteria being required, like a 1 year advance notice for renewal. That's an interesting way to present it. Schedules A and B we spoke about, that's where your capacities are identified and firmly documented. Schedule C establishes one-time and ongoing costs. Schedule F is the Morris Turnberry Partnership Agreement. The schedule makes direct reference to it directly references the North Huron cross-border servicing policy with regard to the contribution to North Huron services and taxation. And the ones that are found specifically in there are contributions to West Cass Community Center, to the Blyth Community Center, to the cemetery, and there's also a contingency fund that's referenced, which was interesting. And as noted earlier, Schedule G was just recently inserted last year. And that was put there to ensure continuity of service, so that should something happen to the agreement, service continued for the locations that the properties that are currently hooked up. Basically, that's it, and the hope again would be that kind of helps shed some light on those who might not have been up on some of the finer details of the agreement itself.
So I'm going to read the motion here. That the Council Township of North Huron hereby receive the report for the Director of Public Works dated July 5th, 2019 regarding the cross-border service agreement between the Township of North Huron and the Municipality of Morris Turnberry for information. And further, the Council received a report in closed session regarding the cross-border service agreement with Morris Turnberry. Do I have a mover? Anita, do I have a seconder? Rick?
Question.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Reed. The Belgrave Arena is not mentioned here, so I know they always have given a little bit, and they brag about supporting the Belgrave Arena because of all their homes, the homes on their side of the town. I've witnessed it. So to me, it should be there and we should be asking for something.
Yep.
I know they give to the arena here, but no, the whole town uses, or a lot of the town uses the arena. So,
All the facilities, yep.
in the park.
Okay, seeing no more questions, I'm gonna call the vote. All in favor? Passes, thank you. Okay, we're gonna go into closed session now. So, you can ask. Closed session reporting out that the Council Township of North Huron hereby proceed at 10:45 a.m. into a camera session closed to the public for discussions on the following. Advice that is subject to a solicitor-client privilege, including communications necessary for the purpose of position, plan, procedure, criteria, and instruction to be applied to any negotiations carried on or to be carried on behalf of the municipality or a local board cross-border agreement. Do I have a mover? Kevin, seconder. Chris, all in favor? Carries. Thank you.
We have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, let's take 5, guys.